Our next speaker is, I hate to say it, but he truly needs no introduction. He's Howard Nations, one of the great trial lawyers, one of the great ATLA members. I won't go through his CV in any kind of detail, but you should know that along with the theme of the presentation today, Howard was one of the first attorneys to have computer-generated liability and medical animations admitted into evidence at trial. He's tried hundreds and hundreds of civil cases to verdict. He's handled more than 300 pro bono criminal cases. Howard co-founded the National College of Advocacy, which is AAJ's educational arm, and he's taught trial advocacy-related courses in law school for 35 years. There's nobody better to talk about this subject, and please give a warm welcome to Howard Nations.
This is an extremely important topic to us, and the reason it is because, first of all, we have a lot of those folks to persuade, and they're different to persuade than the boomers that we've been used to, or even Generation X that we've been used to. First thing, basic communication methods. Verbal communication is 8% of the persuasive process. The words we use are important, but they're only 8% of carrying the message. The vocal communication, which is it's important because sincerity comes from the vocal, and it's 37% of the persuasive process. And the nonverbal communication is 55% of the persuasive process. I tell you this is all very, very fundamental, but I tell you this because this becomes extremely important when we're dealing with the latest generation, the millennials. It's important that we maintain consistency and synthesis among our communicative techniques. The verbal, the nonverbal, and the vocal all have to deliver the same message. If you're saying one thing vocally and your nonverbal communication is sending a different message to the jury, the nonverbal communication will prevail every time. And if you're telling them one message and you're showing them something else, it damages your trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is absolutely crucial to you as the messenger for your client's story. So, data processing. We process data in 3 ways, and again, this has directly to do with the millennials and Gen X. It has to do with everybody, but it really has to do with dealing with the millennials. We process in our minds, in our brains, we process auditorily through sound. We process visually through sight. And then there's the kinesthetic process. And the kinesthetic process is the gut feel that we get, and it arises directly out of nonverbal communication. And since nonverbal communication is 55% of the persuasive process, there's a lot of this kinesthetic going on. This is the situation you get in the jury room, and they say, well, you know, I just heard Mr. Malone's final argument, and you know, it was great, but there's something about that case that just doesn't feel right to me. They can't explain it to you. It's what we'd call a gut feeling. That's an important part of the persuasive process, and that's where the nonverbal communication comes in. They're having this kinesthetic adverse reaction to you and to your message because of something you did nonverbally. So we have to be aware of that synthesis between the 3. Now I'm going to go through this very fast. Liking lawyers, this is extremely important. You're the messenger. And the 3 things that make people like lawyers, the jurors like lawyers, and this is the result of testing with 1,500 actual jurors in cases. First of all is dynamism, keeping them awake, because we essentially bore them to tears. We bore them to tears. The one word most frequently used by jurors in describing jury service, boring, okay? And they watch TV, and they see all these funny things happen in court and all these dramatic things happen in court, and they're going to be on jury service, and they go in and they can barely stay awake. Efficiency, not wasting their time. People don't like to, a lot of people on jury service these days don't like to be there, and they certainly don't want you wasting their time. So show your professionalism by making an efficient presentation of your evidence and do it with confidence. Trustworthiness, again, is the most important thing in the overall picture. If you lose your trustworthiness, then you're damaging your client's case. All right, generational distinctions. These are the generations from 1901 on. The GI generation, Ronald Reagan. The silent generation, MLK and O'Connor, although I don't know you could call MLK silent. But the boomers are just exemplified by the Clintons. Gen X, 68 to 81, the birth years, Kobe Bryant. Generation Y, Mila Kunis. All right, let's look at this, see who we're dealing with, get a better feel for who we're dealing with. The Gen X, Michael Jackson, Kobe Bryant, Leonardo DiCaprio, Serena Williams. There are 40 million Gen Xers, 40 million. Then starting in 82, from 82 to 02, the Millennials. Mila Kunis, the Olsen twins, and so forth. The important thing about that is that there are 75 million of these folks. And the next generation is probably going to be called the W's there for WWW, the World Wide Web generation. They haven't really labeled them that thoroughly yet, but that's the one that comes up most often. I've seen Generation Z. But the ones we're concerned about are the jury pool. Our jury pool consists of 80 million boomers. However, most of those people have figured out by now how to get out of jury service. So Generation X, 40 million boomers, 40 million Gen Xers. The millennials, 75 million. The next thing, let's talk about and I don't want to bore you to death with this, but I have to explain this to you. Core values and cohorts. Core values. People have feelings, they have impressions, but the core values and beliefs are what stay with them. And the importance of these generational cohorts, these are things that happen to these people that are in the same age group, the same generation, that at various times in their lives that bind them together. So these generational cohorts, when you're talking about the things that happened to that whole generation, so they all had the same exposure to the same thing. And these they may have a lifetime impact. And the ones that we're looking at are the sociological events, and they tie people together. And notice the word lifelong. They create lifelong attitudes about jobs, money, and savings. The other are the sociological events that occur in what's called sexual adulthood that influences core values about permissiveness, tolerance, and so forth. But what we're concerned about is the core values that remain unchanged throughout their life. Now, so if they have these attitudes throughout their life, they're not going to change them, then the way we have to deal with it is, it's called they call it in the movies, they call it the suspension of disbelief. How many of you saw the movie Jurassic Park? How many of you really enjoyed Jurassic Park? How many of you believe that there are dinosaurs living on an island off the coast of Costa Rica? 18 of you, damn, that's a lot. Okay. Now, why were you able to enjoy the movie Jurassic Park, even though you know very well intellectually that there are no dinosaurs living on an island off the coast of Costa Rica? The answer to it is the suspension of disbelief. Spielberg did such a great job with that he got you to suspend your disbelief, the fact that you don't believe in dinosaurs. He got you to suspend that for 2.5 hours. All right, we have to do the same thing. When you're dealing with people who have core beliefs and core values that are opposed to what you're trying to prove to them, you're not going to change their core values. Let me say that again. You are not going to change their core values. That's why you're wasting time when you try to stand up there and explain away the McDonald case. When you go into great detail explaining all the reasons why the McDonald case was wrong, because they believe it. And if you start trying to convince them that they're wrong about it, then you're placing yourself exactly on the opposite side of them as an opponent instead of being on the same side. So you have to move forward with them, and you have to get them to suspend their core values if they're opposed to you for just the period of time of your trial. So now, and it can be done. Look at the situation today, for example, where everyone hates Congress, 9% approval rating. Yet but 95% of congressmen are going to get reelected with no problem at all. Why? Everybody hates Congress, but they love their congressman. Okay? Everybody can hate trial lawyers, but they can like the trial lawyer standing in front of them. So you have to be the trial lawyer that they like. That's why liking is so important. So you have to go in, put on a very cohesive, persuasive, honest, totally trustworthy case. You have to show that you care about your client. They can see that. If you don't believe your client's case and you don't really care about your client, then get the hell out of the way and let somebody try the case who does. Because jurors can see that. Do not ever underestimate the collective wisdom of a jury. It's always amazed me. Never underestimate the collective intelligence of a jury or the collective stupidity of voters. And they're the same people. Go figure. So sociological generational studies. The data I'm talking to you about today is not the anecdotal generational stuff that was passed down from the trial lawyers in front of us to us. This stuff is based upon demographic research and forensic psychological applications. So let's talk about Gen X. Gen X, born between 61 and 81, their ages now are 33 to 53. And they call Gen X because they don't have any of those, they didn't have any of those generational cohorts that bound them all together. There were no big events during that period of time like 9/11 or like Pearl Harbor, anything like that bound them all together. So they came up with no strong self-identification. Now, let me tell you about Gen X. They became the target. They were the perfect target of tort reform. They are your major tort reformers. And we'll see that as we go through. Their social phenomena, these people started out with a disrespect for law because they had the highest divorce rates, they had dwindling education, they had the highest crime rates in American history. And so they started out with disrespecting the divorce laws and therefore disrespecting the laws. They really, in terms of their stability, they really want stability. They seek stability. They think stability is important. This is the first generation that actually stayed home longer. They stayed home longer than any previous generations. And they're closer to their parents. And they postponed independent living. This was the group that went back home after college. The average Gen Xer was staying home until they were 28 years old. As opposed to previous generations, the boomers were leaving home. They were going off to college or going off to the military, and they'd never come back. But in this case, Gen X came back home. 51% admire their parents the most of anybody. I guess it's because they let them live at home until they were 28. But they take responsibility for their aging parents because they're still living in the house with them. All right, now here's a big deal on Gen X, self-reliance. Both parents were outside the home, in many cases working. They grew up extremely independent, and the Reagan social cuts cut them first. They were the ones, when Reagan came in and took the knife and cut everything, they cut off all those social cuts for this generation. So these people came up with the idea, or they grew up with the idea of self-reliance. If I don't take care of myself, nobody's going to take care of me. What does that lead to? The number one theme in the courthouse today is personal responsibility, because these people, this generation, they came up with the whole idea that if I don't take care of myself, nobody's going to take care of me. So they also think as a juror, if you don't take care, if you're not doing anything for yourself, so why should I do anything for you? So it wasn't that they devised tort reform and tort reform happened to hit this group. What happened was you had these people, you had this generation out there, and when Karl Rove and the other people involved in the forces of evil went out and started doing focus groups, they were focusing these people. So when they devised tort reform was devised with messages that would fit Gen X. So that's why you'll see it develops very clearly here that self-reliance is the biggest theme. They had no reliance on the government because the government, they cut their social. They had to take care, is there any water? Oh, here we go. They had to take care of their own health care, and they had no deference to authority. They didn't care anything about the government because the government was doing absolutely nothing for them. So think how different this is now. And this is the theme now. You hear any of this? Do you see any of this these days in politics? Employment, no security, no confidence, and security to these folks meant having their own business. This was the first generation in American history. I mean, these folks got pounded. Gen X got pounded. It's the first generation in American history that actually had declining wages. They made less money than their parents, which is why they were back home living with their parents, even after college. So these people, their politics, post-Nixon, they were the weakest attachment to politics. Why? Because they didn't think politicians would do anything for them. The government couldn't be relied on for anything. They had the lowest voter participation for the same reason. No belief in politicians, especially after all the debacle with Nixon. They really resented being tagged on the cover of Time magazine as Generation X. So the characteristics, socially, they were more diverse, they were more tolerant, and there were very much more acceptance of people who were not like themselves. Gen X women, greatest importance, the importance of the home and family, really heavily. If you've got Gen Xers, if you've got damage to a family, if you've got injury to a family, you got loss of a father, loss of a mother, loss of a husband, wife, or child, these people, that resonates with these folks because they are very, very family oriented. Now, their conservative mentality, which is classic with tort reformers, they were much more conservative than their previous generation, and they absolutely rejected blind liberalism of the 60s and the boomers in front of them. They rejected the anti-corporate mentality. We used to stand up with boomers. We're trying cases to boomers. We'd stand up and begin the opening with, this is just another typical case of a corporation placing financial income ahead of the safety of their employees or customers, whatever it was. You couldn't do that today. That would not be a good opening today because these people are skeptical towards the anti-corporate mentality. So they became perfect targets for tort reform. Now, I want you to notice the reason we're separating these out is because the millennials are different. The millennials are different, and you think back to this when we get to the millennials. So these were the perfect targets for tort reform, and they were raised as tort reformers. Personal responsibility was the biggest theme. It was out there constantly. They believed the rhetoric because Rove and the guys figured out how to talk to them. They focused them, and they gathered information from them, and then they messaged that information, and they turned around and fed that information back to them. and they fed it to them over and over and over. So the whole thing about frivolous lawsuits, frivolous malpractice cases, that was the language of Generation X. Generation X thinks greedy trial lawyers is one word. It's so the conservative skepticism. They rejected the boomer rhetoric regarding, listen to this, cheering for the underdogs, which the boomers did. The Clintons, Clinton got a lot of mileage identifying with the underdogs, identifying with the downtrodden. Okay, that's rejected by Generation X. The evil corporate America was rejected. They don't believe corporate America is evil. For one reason is because in their generation, more and more money started to be paying into 401ks, and more of their salaries started to be invested in corporations. Their savings became invested in corporations. So they gained a financial interest as the stock market expanded far beyond just the rich or just people who invested for a living, and Mr. and Mrs. Middle America became inextricably interwoven with the stock market. Then all of a sudden corporate America became good because these are the guys who are creating my future. So that's why it became tougher to sue corporations. Equality for all, that's just boomer rhetoric. That's way too idealistic. So these folks are the perfect tort reformers, and you got to hand it to them. They've done it. They've done a very effective job. The AIDS crisis created conservative and cautious mentality, and they're cautious throughout. They were also, though, they learn best through imagery, but they don't respond. They're just conservative, so they just don't learn through. They reject flashy advertising and things of that nature. Now, they're cynical. They're very cynical. They believe more in UFOs than in receipt of their Social Security. Does that sound like anything you hear if you ever watch Fox News? 25. I was amazed by this statistic. Only 25% regard themselves as religious. That is a very, very low number. But these folks just felt rejected by everybody. So here's how you communicate, things to take in mind when you're communicating with them. They have high regard for long-established traditions. So what you want to do with these folks is you want to talk about rules. You want to talk about traditions. So if you're trying to malpractice case, you want to wrap your client in the Hippocratic Oath and the violation of the Hippocratic Oath by the defendant. First, do no harm. And they will respond to any type of rules that are rules that are grounded in long-held traditions. Secondly, they're persuaded by themes dealing with such as rules of the road, regulations. Now, this is even more so. This is where they're very much like the millennials, because these folks are raised with rules. Everything they do is done with rules. So when you're talking about a med-mal case, you talk about protocols. You talk about the violation of protocols, the violation of standards, the violations of rules. When you're talking about driving, you're talking about the rules of the road, but don't just talk about it. Put it up on the screen. Let them see it. Let them look at the rule. When your expert talks about what the rule is, show them what the rule is. Show and tell on the rule. And then talk about the rule, the purpose of the rule, how they violated the rule, and the result of them violating the rule. Rules resonate with these people. They relate to themes that appeal to their pragmatism, and this is their kind of their mantra. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. They resonate to themes that deal with their big theme is self-reliance. They were raised with self-reliance. So if you represent a plaintiff who is severely injured, and as a result of his or her injury, they are no longer self-reliant. They have to rely on somebody else to help them to get around, to help them to move, to help them. And of course, the worse the injury, the more these people would respond to it. if you talk about not the fact that they are completely dependent on someone else, but you compare it to how self-reliant your plaintiff was before versus how their self-reliance has totally been lost, because self-reliance is critical to Gen X. So it's damage to self-reliance will resonate with these folks. They mistrust boomers, but they have a close relationship with their own parents, and they place family and quality of life above a career. More than any other generation, they reject whiners. Never refer to your client as a victim, and never put your client on the stand and have them whine about how much it hurts and where it hurts. What you should be really, this is for everybody, not just Gen Xers, but you should be proving up that your client is doing the very best they can with what they have left. My theme is always courage in a personal injury case. I try to demonstrate the courage that my client has. They have this was their life before, this was their life as a result of these horrible injuries, but they're facing it with courage. They're not seeking sympathy, they're not whining, they're facing it with courage, and this is the third life they're going to have, so what's going to be the rest of their life. So talk about courage as the theme, as opposed to trying to get sympathy. The Xers are cautious and practical, and they don't respond to hyperbole, drama, or overstatement. And they will listen for that. Remember, these are the tort reformers. These are the people that are taught that you're going to stand up there and you're going to lie to them right off the bat, that you're greedy trial lawyers, and from the minute you stand up in front of one on voir dire examination or opening statement, they're going to be expecting hyperbole from you. And if you deliver hyperbole, then you're going to be playing right directly into the theme that they've been taught. Yep, greedy trial lawyers. It's important so with that in mind, instead of just hyperbole, you have to support your claim substantively. It's a conscious mind evidence, which is hard evidence. And when it comes to this, you have to sequence properly. Sequence your evidence. Put your hard evidence in first. The hard evidence are numbers, things they can see, x-rays, real medical evidence that you have, the documents, things that they can see and feel and touch, not the physical pain, mental anguish, that sort of thing. You've got to establish your liability in the mind of these people first. You've got to establish it substantively, and then you have to support it. But you have to support it substantively early in the game, because remember, you're not starting on a level playing field with Generation X. You're starting with people that think you're going to be giving them hyperbole. So that's why it's so important to support it with substantive evidence. All right, let's talk about the next gen. These folks are pretty fascinating. This is their hero, Colbert and Jon Stewart. This is where they get their news more from Jon Stewart than they do not watch the news channels, ABC, CBS, NBC. They don't watch because they don't care. They get their news from Jon Stewart, and so do I, because he's the most accurate. All right, so how do we deal with these people? Gen Xers won't even talk to each other. I mean, Gen Y, the millennials, they won't even talk to each other. So what the hell makes you think they're going to listen to you? You can have them sitting, you can see them in a restaurant sitting there texting. They're texting each other. They're sitting across the table from each other. You have to understand their motivations. You have to deal with these folks with show and tell, mostly show. You have to support everything. And then you use standard focus techniques, which I'll try to get to here in a minute. All right. Let's talk about who they are. They're born from 82 to 02. Their ages now are 12 to 32. There are a great number of those folks are on our juries these days, and more are coming on every year. They're the children of the boomers. They're the younger siblings of the Xers. They are totally technological. 94% have cell phones, 76% use instant messaging, 92% multitask. and message, usually while they're driving. They're the second largest population, 75 million of these folks. Now, here's where they start really separating out from Gen X. They self-identify. This is they self-identify as only 38% self-identify as white. They got left off. They're more liberal and more Democrat than ever before. These are the folks who, more than any other single demographic, these are the folks that elected Obama as president. 50% are entering college, which is the highest percentage ever. Now, you want to start talking to these folks about how your poor old client lost wages while he was off from work. They'd say, welcome to our world, except that at least he had a job. Their unemployment rate is 20%, so they're not going to be, they've really got to have some really strong proof on somebody being hurt in that manner. They have less health insurance. They have the highest rate of obesity. They have concerns about their own declining health. They feel, now here's where they completely diverge from Gen X. They feel that the government, especially the federal government, should be doing more instead of less for them. They have a very adverse view of business. They want a job. They're looking for jobs. They really want to be employed, but they want to be employed in a job that has self-esteem, offers self-esteem. They're heavily burdened with school debt. So when you keep this in mind when you're talking to these folks and you're talking about your plaintiff who has a lot of medical debts and a lot of lost income and that sort of thing, they can identify, but there's also a reverse discrimination thing that can come into play there if you're not careful. These people are very, very, very strong rules followers. So this is why I'm saying they're accepting of authority. They follow rules. They're the most supervised generation in history. So you want to use rules of the road with these folks more than with anyone else. Now, the reason they're called the Millennials is they were in the high school class of 2000. So let's look quickly at some of the top 10 events. This is what they chose as the top 10 events of their life. It was Columbine, Kosovo, the Oklahoma City bombing, the death of Princess Di, the Clinton impeachment, O.J. Simpson, Rodney King, Levinsky, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. But these are theirs. This is their choices. The McGuire-Sosa home run race. I don't know how that got in there, but okay, this is their choice. This is also self-identifiers. Here's how they think of themselves, so you need to tap into what they think of themselves. Positive attitude, cooperative team players, accepting of authority. They are not out there. They are not the strong individuals that Gen X was. Self-reliance is not their big deal. Teamwork is their big deal. Very different things. So the old thing about self-reliance is not going to play as much with this group. They're definite rules followers, most supervised in history. They regard themselves, again, this is how they identify themselves, as smarter, progressive, and as being cutting edge. They feel like this is they're the first generation that know more than every generation thinks they know more than their parents. But this generation actually does, because they're looking at technology. And so when the 4-year-old kid has to teach grandma how to use the iPhone, they regard themselves as cutting edge. They are better educated, and they're global because of the World Wide Web. So all those things play into, take into account. They're near polar opposites of the boomers, who are their parents, and the Xers, who are their siblings. So this generation now is much, much, much better for us. They're not as subject to the tort reform as the Gen Xers were, and many of them, a law degree to these folks is the goal of a good, healthy number of these people. And either they or their friends are heading, 50% of them are going to college, and then either they or their friends are trying to get to law school. So the profession goes up in the eyes of this generation. Now, 12 negative key events. These are the cohort events. 911, the dot-com failures, corporate corruption, the divided country, the untrustworthy politicians, Iraq and Afghan wars, lack of security, shrinking salaries, shrinking opportunities, outsourcing of jobs, insourcing of foreign workers, taking jobs they would have had, and downsizing. So they have a lot of negative events as they see as playing against them. Generic communication, we'll go through these very rapidly. You prime your information for these folks just as you would in a news story: who, what, when, where, why, and how. You sequence your story to show proof to back up the allegations and the charges that you talked about in the opening statement. Early proof, early hard proof, conscious mind appeal. The next thing is the plaintiff needs to have a definite plan of rehabilitation. This is part of the courage. You have to answer the question. Always be ready before you get to the courthouse, and don't do this the night before closing argument. You have to do it. You have to go over there knowing what you're going to do. What are you doing for yourself? That's what they want to know. What are you doing for yourself? You also answer the question, what good purpose will be served by an award of damages in this case? And you have to tell them, you have to have a plan to show them why money would actually improve the life of this person. Don't use the word, don't be the injured person. Don't act as if just because you're injured, you're entitled to compensation. Avoid the term victim completely. Don't ever refer to your clients as victims. And prove that it's not enough. We used to just come in and prove that our client was injured and that they had injuries and they needed money to pay medical bills and wage loss and so forth. That's not enough. Now you not only have to prove that they're in need, but you have to prove that they're worthy of their help. So the worthiness comes from, what are you doing for yourself? You're doing everything for yourself, then I don't mind helping you. Personal responsibility remains the generic theme. All right, now let me tell you about this very quickly, about the conscious mind. There are two parts of the brain. One is the conscious mind, the other is the unconscious mind. Conscious mind proof that I talked about, that you have to put sequence first, is hard evidence. It's things like the court's charge. That's hard evidence. That's something they get their teeth into. So you pull out the portions, the phrases from the court's charge, and make them part of your case. Visual evidence, and support it by numbers, and you have to get them to focus. You have to get them to focus on your evidence. And you get the focus on the evidence through visual evidence. You get it through with timelines, interactive timelines. And Adam's absolutely correct. The only problem with timelines is everybody tries to put their entire case on the timeline. You don't do that. Timelines are the precise points that you need to put up there, but they're extremely valuable and helpful to jurors. Now, in the unconscious mind is what Kahneman refers to as the hardwired mind. So, okay, whatever you do, do not think of a pink elephant. Okay? How many of you thought of a pink elephant? Yeah, knock it out of your head. Go ahead. No, the reason you did is because that went straight to your unconscious mind, the hardwired part. The hardwired part means the mind acts on its own. It doesn't need you to stop and think, well, let me deliberate about that, or let me think that through. Okay, when you're communicating with the unconscious mind, it is most effectively done in the present tense. So when you're storytelling, when you're doing your closing argument and you're storytelling the events that occurred to the plaintiff, tell them in the present tense. Use visual images and use colors in your descriptions. And involve as many, when you're telling a story, involve as many senses as you can, because when you involve, the more senses you involve, the more you communicate with the unconscious mind. And you avoid negatives, because the unconscious mind does not register negatives. And the unconscious mind is where massive amounts of decision-making takes place. It's only where you have to reason something through that you have to go to the conscious mind. Rhetorical devices. The reason metaphors are so powerful is because they go straight to the unconscious mind, just like the pink elephant. Analogies, the same thing. All your rhetorical devices, a rule of three. These things are memorable. They resonate in the unconscious mind. The rhetorical questions, and you seek similarities. We're all like people who are like ourselves. Seek similarities between yourself and the jury, between your client and the jury, between your expert witnesses and your jury, and bring those similarities out. Nonverbal communication, vocal communication, neuro-linguistic programming. Those are the three things that we're really dealing with. Now, when I get through this, I've sped through this so I could get to this part of it. Focusing on the demographics. So how do you tell the difference between Generation X and Generation Y? The way you do it is you do focus groups within the demographic group. So what we'll do, you listen for how they talk about the language of the case. You listen to the rhetorical devices that they use. What metaphors do they use? What analogies do they use? But the way we do it, you test your technology with them. You test your interactive timelines with them. You test your photographs. You test your animation. Test every piece of evidence that a jury will see with them, and then you test your storytelling, and you create storytelling using their language. Now, the way you do this is you start with a very vanilla presentation, which means that there's no advocacy involved. You simply tell the story. You read the story to them. You're not trying to persuade them of anything. You read the story, and I'll get 18 or 20 or 22 focus group members. Let's take 20. We'll put 20 people in the room, and we'll make this vanilla presentation. And we'll break them up. So they all hear the same thing. Then you break them up into distinct groups. You put all of Generation X together in one group of 10. You put all of your Generation Y, your millennials, together in another group of 10, and you listen to the difference, and then you give them the same identical questionnaires, so you have them write things down on a written questionnaire first before they start influencing each other. And then you video the whole proceedings. Now, what you'll find, you're listening to the language that they use to talk about your case. What analogies do they use? What metaphors? And you'll find that Gen X will use different metaphors because they're grasping their own, from their own lives, those metaphors that they think are useful and forceful. Then you'll hear different rhetorical devices used by the millennials. So we break them up, and you have you'll be amazed at the difference that you'll get. And then we do a rule of three quiz, and at the end of the whole thing, after we debrief them and do everything else, we do a rule of three, and we'll ask them something like, what were the three most important pieces of evidence in this case from the plaintiff? Or there's several threes you can do. What are the three things that you would most like to know that you don't have an answer to at this time? From all the things you've heard today, what are the three most important questions that you have right now that are in your mind that you don't know the answer to? That type thing. And you have them write those down. And then you test your graphics, you certainly test your timelines. I've put demonstrative evidence on for decades with focus groups. We started using focus groups in 1984. And I've never used, in a trial, I've never used a demonstrative evidence. I've never used anything I show to a jury that I don't present it to a focus group first. And I will tell you that in at least 80% of all the graphics that I've shown to juries where I thought they were finished, as far as I was concerned, boy, these are good. I think about probably 4 out of 5, the focus group members have added some piece of information or given me a new viewpoint or done something that make this appear a lot better than what I thought was just absolutely wonderful. So you go over medical protocols with them. You try to get their answer to what's the difference in generational storytelling? How do you tell a story to the Gen X different from Gen Y? You test your case-specific facts, and then you test them on each separate element of damage. This isn't all in one focus group. These are a group of focus groups. You test them on physical pain. You test them on mental anguish, physical disability, the physical disfigurement, damage to wage earning capacity. Each element of damage, you test them individually. Thank you very much for your attention.